Hi, I'm Zoe. For 3 years, I let my friends think I was financially hopeless. I split dinner bills down to the penny, bought generic cereal, and wore the same thrift store jacket through 2 Colorado winters. They rolled their eyes when I counted quarters for coffee, staged interventions about my money anxiety, and constantly offered unsolicited financial advice. What they didn't know was that while they were lecturing me about budgeting apps and emergency funds, my investment portfolio had just crossed $890 million. Last quarter alone, I made more than most people see in 10 lifetimes. And when they finally discovered the truth, they didn't celebrate my success. They tried to destroy me for it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain air in Millbrook, Colorado carried that sharp October bite that made your lungs ache if you breathed too deep. I pulled my beaten Honda Civic into the gravel parking lot of the Rusty Anchor, the engine making that concerning rattling sound that had been getting progressively worse for the past 6 months. The sound was genuine, which made it perfect for my purposes. My friends expected me to drive something unreliable, to stress about repair costs, to wince when Brandon suggested we split an Uber instead of walking the 12 blocks back to Pine Ridge Apartments. Through the frost-edged windows of the bar, I could see them already gathered around our usual corner table. Brandon Walsh sat with his back to the wall, brown hair perfectly styled despite claiming he couldn't afford a proper haircut. Mia Rodriguez gestured animatedly while talking to Tyler Kim, who nodded along while scrolling through his phone. Chloe Bennett sat slightly apart, nursing what looked like her first drink of many. They were my people, or so I had convinced myself for the better part of 3 years. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, making sure the carefully cultivated image was intact. Faded jeans with a genuine hole in the knee, not the designer kind that cost more than my monthly rent at Pine Ridge. A sweater I had deliberately shrunk in the wash, creating that slightly desperate look of someone trying to make old clothes last. The thrift store jacket that had become my signature piece, complete with a coffee stain on the left sleeve that I refreshed monthly to maintain authenticity. My dark blonde hair was pulled back in a messy bun secured with a rubber band instead of a proper hair tie. And I had deliberately chosen the drugstore mascara that flaked by evening. The performance had become second nature. 3 years of calculated poverty, 3 years of strategic struggle, 3 years of letting them believe I was drowning while I was actually soaring higher than any of them could imagine. It had started as a social experiment, a way to see who my real friends were beneath the surface pleasantries. What I discovered was far more twisted than I had anticipated. The cold mountain air hit my face as I stepped out of the car, and I could smell wood smoke from the fireplace inside, mixed with the scent of pine trees and the approaching winter. Millbrook was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were currency and gossip traveled faster than the morning coffee delivery to Main Street Diner. Population 8,000, 2 ski slopes, 1 major employer besides the tourist industry, and endless opportunities for people to involve themselves in each other's business. I had moved here after college, ostensibly to take a job as a teller at Millbrook Community Bank. The position paid $32,000 a year, barely enough to cover rent, utilities, and groceries, if you budgeted carefully. It was perfect cover for someone who needed to explain modest living, while secretly managing a portfolio that generated more wealth in a single market day than most residents would see in their entire lives. The brass handle of the Rusty Anchor was cold against my palm as I pushed through the heavy wooden door. The interior hit me with a wave of warmth and the sound of local classic rock, playing just loud enough to encourage conversation without drowning it out. Mason jars filled with string lights hung from the exposed beam ceiling, and the walls were covered with vintage Colorado license plates and black and white photographs of the town's mining days. It was aggressively quaint in the way that tourist towns perfected, but the drinks were strong and the locals genuinely friendly. Brandon spotted me first, raising his hand in that casual wave that somehow managed to convey both welcome and mild annoyance. I had kept them waiting exactly 7 minutes, just long enough to suggest I was struggling with something financial, but not long enough to be truly rude. Timing was everything and maintaining the illusion. I slid into the empty chair they had saved for me.
immediately reaching for the worn menu even though I hadn't memorized. The prices at the Rusty Anchor were reasonable by mountain town standards, but I had trained my friends to expect me to study every item carefully, calculating costs and making strategic compromises. Tonight's performance would involve ordering the cheapest appetizer and a single beer, nursing both throughout the evening while contributing just enough to conversations to avoid seeming antisocial. Mia leaned forward across the small table, her dark eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm that usually preceded either gossip or unsolicited advice. She worked as a dental hygienist at the clinic downtown and had an opinion about everything, especially my finances. Her black hair was pulled into a sleek ponytail that probably cost more to maintain than I claimed to spend on groceries in a month. She wore a soft blue sweater that looked expensive but not ostentatiously so, the kind of subtle wealth display that characterized most of my friend group. Tyler looked up from his phone long enough to acknowledge my arrival with a nod. He managed the sporting goods store that catered to tourists and locals alike, selling everything from ski equipment to hiking boots to fishing licenses. His Asian features were sharp and intelligent, and he had a habit of analyzing people like they were business problems to be solved. Tonight, he seemed distracted, which usually meant he was dealing with inventory issues or staffing problems. Chloe offered a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She taught second grade at Millbrook Elementary and had the kind of nurturing personality that extended to everyone around her, sometimes to her own detriment. Her light brown hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and she wore a simple green dress that flattered her figure without drawing too much attention. She was the most genuinely kind person in our group, which made what would eventually happen all the more heartbreaking. Brandon dominated the space around him without trying. He worked in sales for a tech company based in Denver, commuting down the mountain 3 days a week and working remotely the rest of the time. His confidence bordered on arrogance, but he had the charisma to make it seem charming rather than offensive. He was also the reason I had started this elaborate deception in the first place. We had met at a community volunteer event 3 years ago, organizing care packages for families affected by the early season wildfire that had threatened the town's western edge. I had been genuinely attracted to him, drawn to his easy laugh and apparent commitment to helping others. We flirted over sorting donations and sharing coffee from the community center's ancient percolator. When he asked me out, I said yes without hesitation. The first few dates went well. He was attentive, funny, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. He paid for dinners without making a show of it, suggested activities that we could both enjoy, and listened when I talked about my work at the bank. I found myself imagining a future with him, something I hadn't done with anyone since college.
Then I made the mistake of mentioning my investment portfolio. It was our fourth date, dinner at a nice restaurant in Vail where he had driven us for what he called a proper night out. The wine had loosened my tongue, and when he complained about his student loans, I casually mentioned that I had been lucky with some early cryptocurrency investments and had managed to build a decent portfolio. I was deliberately vague, suggesting I had maybe 50 or 60,000 saved up, enough to be comfortable, but not enough to fundamentally change my lifestyle. His entire demeanor shifted. Suddenly, I wasn't Zoe, the small-town bank teller he was getting to know. I was Zoe, the potential financial opportunity. The conversation pivoted to investment strategies, retirement planning, and his brilliant ideas for starting a consulting business if he just had the initial capital. When the check came, he suggested I pay since I was obviously doing so well with money. I paid, but something cold settled in my stomach that had nothing to do with the mountain air during our drive back to Millbrook. Over the following weeks, Brandon's interest in my supposed investment success grew while his romantic interest cooled. He started asking specific questions about my portfolio, suggesting we move in together to combine our financial resources, and introducing me to friends who happened to have business ideas that needed funding. That was when I decided to disappear financially. Not literally, but in terms of the wealth I allowed others to see.
I moved from my comfortable one-bedroom apartment to a studio at Pine Ridge, the kind of place that young people chose when they were saving money or couldn't afford anything better. I traded my reliable Subaru for the aging Honda. I started shopping at thrift stores not for vintage finds, but for convincingly worn clothing. Most importantly, I began performing financial stress. The transformation was gradual enough to seem realistic. I started declining expensive activities, suggesting cheaper alternatives, and expressing anxiety about money in small, believable ways. I opened checking and savings accounts with Millbrook Community Bank that held just enough to cover my apparent expenses, while my real wealth remained hidden in investment accounts managed through a firm in Denver. Brandon's behavior became a fascinating case study in human psychology. As my apparent financial status declined, his romantic interest returned. He started paying for dates again, offering to help with my budget, and positioning himself as my financial savior. He introduced me to his friends as someone who was learning to manage money, with the condescending tone of someone explaining a complex concept to a child.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The friend group that formed around us operated on similar dynamics. They all made decent money by small-town Colorado standards. Mia pulled in about $50,000 a year at the dental clinic. Tyler earned similar amounts from the sporting goods store, and Chloe's teaching salary was supplemented by summer tutoring. Brandon claimed to make around $70,000, though I suspected it was closer to $55,000 based on his actual spending patterns. They were comfortable, secure, and apparently united in their concern for my financial welfare. What started as casual advice became increasingly invasive. They staged interventions about my spending habits, recommended budgeting apps, and frequently offered to loan me money for everything from car repairs to groceries. The loans always came with strings attached, implicit expectations that I would be grateful enough to provide something in return. Brandon suggested I could show my appreciation by cooking dinner for the group, which somehow became a regular expectation. Mia thought I should handle the social media for her side business selling handmade jewelry, unpaid work that would help me build skills while saving her money. Tyler wanted help organizing inventory at the store during busy seasons, presenting it as an opportunity for me to earn extra cash while doing him a favor.
The most insidious part was how they framed their exploitation as generosity. They were helping poor Zoe, offering opportunities to someone who clearly needed them, being good friends to someone who was struggling. The narrative they created made them the heroes, and me the grateful recipient of their charity. Any resistance or reluctance on my part was evidence of my poor attitude or inability to appreciate what they were doing for me. Tonight felt different as I settled into my chair and listened to their familiar chatter about work, weekend plans, and the approaching ski season. There was an undercurrent of excitement that I couldn't quite identify, a sense that something was about to happen. Brandon kept checking his phone with barely concealed anticipation, and Mia had that particular brightness that usually preceded major gossip or news. I ordered my usual cheapest option, a basket of loaded potato skins and a Coors Light, while the others selected more expensive entrees without consulting the prices. The conversation flowed around familiar topics: Tyler's frustration with tourist customers who didn't understand basic equipment, Chloe's challenges with a particularly difficult parent at school, Mia's latest jewelry designs that weren't selling as well as she hoped. Brandon dominated the discussion with stories from his sales meetings in Denver, positioning himself as the sophisticated professional among small-town friends. He had a talent for making his work sound more important than it probably was, using business jargon and dropping names of companies that meant nothing to us but sounded impressive. Tonight, he seemed especially animated, gesturing widely and speaking louder than necessary. As the evening progressed, I began to sense they were building towards something. Conversations had undercurrents, inside jokes that I wasn't part of, and meaningful looks exchanged when they thought I wasn't paying attention. By the time our food arrived, I was certain they had discussed something about me before I joined them. Mia was the first to breach whatever wall they had built around their secret. She leaned forward across the table, her expression serious, despite the beer she had been drinking. Her voice carried that tone adults used when discussing something important with a child who might not fully understand. The mountain wind rattled the windows of the rusty anchor as she spoke, and I realized that whatever was coming would change everything between us. 3 years of careful performance had led to this moment, and I could feel the elaborate house of cards I had built beginning to sway in anticipation of collapse. But collapse, I was beginning to understand, could be a form of liberation. Sometimes the only way to reveal the truth was to stop pretending to be someone you weren't, even if that truth destroyed the relationships you had built on lies. The question was whether anything real had ever existed beneath the deception, or if I had been performing for an audience that had never really seen me at all. As Mia opened her mouth to speak, I realized I was about to find out. Mia cleared her throat and placed her hands flat on the scarred wooden table. The gesture was deliberate, practiced, like she had rehearsed this moment. Her voice carried the tone of someone delivering news they believed was both important and helpful, the kind of intervention that friends staged when they thought someone was making poor life choices. "Zoe, we've been talking, and we're worried about you." She glanced around the table, gathering silent support from the others before continuing. "Your financial situation keeps getting worse instead of better, and we think it's time for some tough love." Brandon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone who had appointed himself the voice of reason. "Look, we care about you, which is why we're going to be direct. You're 28 years old, still living in a studio apartment, driving a car that's falling apart, and you can't even afford to split dinner without counting change."
Something has to change. Tyler nodded in agreement, finally looking up from his phone to join the conversation. "We've watched you struggle for 3 years now. At some point, accepting help isn't charity, it's just smart." Chloe remained quiet, but her expression suggested she had been part of whatever discussion had led to this moment. Her silence felt more uncomfortable than the others' words, as if she understood the cruelty of what they were doing, but lacked the courage to speak against it. I sat perfectly still, my face arranged in the expression of someone receiving difficult but well-intentioned advice. Inside, a different kind of calculation was taking place. This was the moment I had been unconsciously preparing for, the inevitable result of 3 years of performed vulnerability. They had finally decided I needed saving, which meant they were ready to position themselves as my saviors. Mia reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, placing it on the table between us like evidence in a trial. "We put together a budget for you, a real one, based on your salary and what we know about your expenses. If you follow it exactly, you can pay off your credit card debt in 18 months and start building an emergency fund." The budget was impressive in its detail and completely wrong in its assumptions. They had calculated my income based on what a bank teller in Millbrook would earn, factored in rent for my studio apartment, estimated food and utility costs, and allocated tiny amounts for entertainment and savings. The numbers were logical, responsible, and bore no relationship to my actual financial reality. Brandon slid another paper across the table. "And this is a business proposal. Tyler and I have been developing an idea for a seasonal adventure tourism company. Guided hiking in summer, snowshoe tours in winter. We have the expertise, the connections, and the marketing plan. What we need is initial capital." I glanced at the proposal, noting the professional formatting and detailed financial projections. They had clearly spent considerable time developing this presentation. The amount they were seeking was $50,000, which they had calculated as the maximum I could potentially access through credit cards, small loans, and liquidating whatever modest investments they assumed I possessed. Tyler leaned forward, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he probably used with customers at the sporting goods store. Here's the beautiful part. You wouldn't just be helping us get started, you'd be a full partner, entitled to a share of profits. It's an investment in your own future, not just a loan. The mathematics were elegant in their manipulation. They had positioned themselves as doing me a favor by allowing me to invest in their venture, while simultaneously requiring me to assume all the financial risk. If the business succeeded, they would benefit from my capital and their sweat equity. If it failed, I would absorb the losses while they moved on to other opportunities. Mia's jewelry business had been a similar arrangement disguised as friendship. Over the past year, I had helped by creating social media content, photographing products, managing online sales, and even handling customer service inquiries. My compensation was the satisfaction of supporting a friend's dreams and the promise that I was gaining valuable experience. The business generated modest profits that went entirely to Mia, while I provided labor that would have cost her several $100s monthly if she had hired actual employees. Brandon had been even more creative in his extraction methods. He frequently suggested activities that positioned him as the generous provider while creating implicit obligations for me to reciprocate. Expensive dinners where he paid, but expected me to express gratitude through physical affection or domestic labor. Weekend trips where he covered travel costs, but I was responsible for planning, booking accommodations, and managing all logistics. Concert tickets and sporting events where his financial contribution earned him the role of decision-maker, while I provided companionship and enthusiasm. The most insidious aspect of their approach was how they had woven financial dependence into emotional intimacy. Every loan, every favor, every act of apparent generosity created debt that they expected to be repaid through gratitude, loyalty, and compliance. They had constructed a system where my supposed poverty made me valuable to them, while my gratitude for their help justified their increasing demands on my time, energy, and resources. Chloe finally spoke, her voice soft but carrying an edge of frustration that surprised me. "Zoe, we're trying to help you build something better, but you have to want it too. Sometimes it feels like you're content to just struggle forever instead of taking steps to improve your situation." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, acrid and uncomfortable. She was suggesting that my financial struggles were a choice, a form of self-sabotage that their intervention could remedy if I would just accept their guidance and follow their plan. The implication was that any resistance to their proposals reflected my own limitations, rather than legitimate concerns about their motivations. I looked around the table at these four people who had become central to my social life in Millbrook. Mia, with her confident smile and carefully styled hair, convinced she was offering wisdom earned through her own modest success. Tyler checking his phone again, treating this conversation like a business meeting, where emotions were irrelevant to the bottom line. Brandon radiating the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way through charisma and persistence. Chloe appearing genuinely concerned, but unwilling to question the group consensus that had formed around my supposed inadequacy. They had no idea that while we sat in this mountain bar discussing my need for their $50,000 business opportunity, my portfolio had gained nearly $2 million in market value since the opening bell that morning. The quarterly report I had received 3 days ago showed a total value of $893,400,000. The annual management fees alone exceeded their combined salaries. The monthly dividends from my pharmaceutical investments could have funded their adventure tourism business without touching the principal. But they didn't want a wealthy partner. They wanted a grateful dependent, someone whose gratitude justified their sense of superiority and whose desperation made their modest generosity feel meaningful. They had fallen in love with the version of me that needed them, not the person I actually was. The realization crystallized as I sat there, listening to them outline their expectations. This intervention wasn't about helping me succeed. It was about ensuring my continued dependence on their support. They needed me to remain just poor enough to be grateful for their assistance, just struggling enough to make their advice feel valuable, just vulnerable enough to justify their increasing demands on my life. Brandon reached across the table and placed his hand over mine, his expression sincere in the way that preceded requests for significant favors. Zoe, I know this is a lot to process, but we've been friends for 3 years now, and I think we've proven that we care about you. This business opportunity isn't just about money. It's about all of us building something together. His touch felt different now that I understood the calculation behind it. The warmth that had once made my pulse quicken now felt manipulative, a practiced gesture designed to create intimacy that justified financial obligation. I wondered how many times he had used similar techniques with other women, how many relationships he had monetized through careful applications of charm and manufactured emotional connection. Mia nodded enthusiastically, her earlier seriousness replaced by the excitement of someone discussing a shared adventure.
And think about how good it will feel to be a real partner in something instead of just getting by paycheck to paycheck. You'll have ownership, equity, a stake in the success instead of just trading hours for dollars at the bank. The irony was devastating. While she spoke about the satisfaction of ownership and equity, I was simultaneously receiving push notifications from my investment management app showing real-time updates on my stakes in companies they had probably never heard of. My portfolio included significant positions in emerging technology firms, renewable energy infrastructure, international real estate investment trusts, and commodity futures that responded to global market movements they couldn't even pronounce. Tyler finally put his phone down and leaned forward, his analytical mind focusing on what he probably considered the conversation's crucial moment. Here's what I think is happening, Zoe. You've gotten comfortable with struggling. It's become your identity, and changing that feels scary even when the opportunity is right in front of you. His psychological analysis was breathtaking in its confidence and complete inaccuracy. He had constructed an entire narrative about my personality and motivations based on 3 years of carefully crafted performance, then used that fictional foundation to justify his conclusions about what I needed and wanted. The expertise he claimed in reading people was actually just projection, assuming that others shared his own relationship with money and success. Chloe reached for her second drink, the action suggesting she was preparing to say something that required additional courage. When she spoke, her voice carried the teacher's tone she used with particularly challenging students who needed firm guidance. Maybe we should talk about the real issue here. You say you want to be independent and financially stable, but your actions don't match your words. You turn down overtime at the bank, you won't take the promotion Rachel offered last month, and you've never once asked us for advice about investments or career planning. She had identified behaviors that contradicted the narrative of desperate poverty, but her interpretation was exactly wrong. I turned down overtime because I was already working 60-hour weeks managing my investment portfolio. I declined Rachel's promotion because it would have required more visible financial documentation that might compromise my cover story. I avoided asking for investment advice because I was already employing a team of professionals who manage more wealth than everyone in Millbrook would see in their combined lifetimes. But Chloe's observation revealed something else. They had been watching me more carefully than I realized. Cataloging my choices and building theories about my motivations, the casual friendship I thought we shared was actually a form of surveillance, with each of them gathering evidence to support their shared conclusion that I needed their intervention. Brandon squeezed my hand gently, his voice dropping to the intimate tone he used during our most private conversations. Zoe, I need you to really hear this. We're offering you a chance to change your life, not just financially, but in terms of how you see yourself and what you believe you deserve. The manipulation was elegant in its emotional sophistication. He was positioning my acceptance of their proposal as an act of self-love, a declaration that I deserved better than my current circumstances. Refusal would be evidence of low self-esteem, fear of success, or inability to accept help from people who cared about me. He had constructed the argument so that agreement was the only response that could be interpreted as psychologically healthy. Mia opened her purse again and withdrew a small stack of business cards.
I've already talked to some people who might be interested in guided tours. Rachel's brother-in-law runs that adventure travel blog, and he said he'd feature us if we get started before ski season. Plus, Tyler has connections with all the equipment rental places, and Brandon knows the permit process from his tech company's team building retreats.
They had been planning this venture for months, developing contacts and building infrastructure while assuming my eventual participation. My role wasn't collaborative partner, but rather financing mechanism. The person whose desperation would provide capital while their expertise provided value. They had gambled that my financial stress would eventually reach a point where their offer would seem like salvation rather than exploitation. The evening light outside the rusty anchor was fading into that deep purple that preceded mountain darkness. Other patrons were finishing their meals and heading home to prepare for another day of work or tourism or whatever brought them to this small Colorado town. Our table remained isolated in its bubble of serious conversation. 4 people convinced they were saving a 5th who was too foolish or frightened to save herself. Tyler pulled out his phone again, but this time to show me something rather than escape the conversation. Look, I've been tracking adventure tourism revenue in similar markets. With proper marketing and competitive pricing, we're projecting gross revenues of $200,000 in the first year, growing to $400,000 by year 3. His financial projections were optimistic but not unreasonable for a well-executed venture in a mountain town with established tourist infrastructure. What he didn't understand was that the numbers he was presenting represented less than what my portfolio generated in quarterly dividends from my utility stock positions alone. The business success he envisioned as life-changing would be statistically insignificant compared to my actual net worth. But the presentation revealed something more important than their business acumen. They had spent considerable time and effort developing this proposal specifically for me, calculating exactly how much money they thought I could access and structuring the request to match those perceived limitations. They had studied my supposed financial situation with the attention to detail that real entrepreneurs applied to market research. Chloe finished her drink and leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from concern to something that looked almost like disappointment. I think we need to be honest about something else, Zoe. If you're not willing to invest in yourself and your future, then maybe you need to think about what kind of friend you want to be to the rest of us. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. My continued inclusion in their social circle was contingent on my acceptance of their financial intervention and business proposal. Refusal would be interpreted not just as poor judgment, but as betrayal of the friendship they had offered me. They were prepared to withdraw their emotional support if I wouldn't provide the financial support they needed. Brandon nodded in agreement, his hand still covering mine, but his grip tightening slightly. Friendship is about mutual support, right? We've been there for you through some tough times, and now we're offering you a chance to be part of something bigger. But it has to go both ways. The accounting of favors was fascinating in its selective accuracy. They remembered every dinner Brandon had paid for, every piece of advice Mia had offered, every small loan Tyler had provided, and every emotional support session Chloe had facilitated. They had carefully tracked their investments in our friendship and were now expecting returns that justified their continued participation. What they had forgotten or deliberately ignored were the countless hours I had contributed to their various projects and businesses. The social media content I created for Mia's jewelry sales, the inventory management and customer service I provided for Tyler's store during busy seasons, the meal preparation and event planning I handled for group gatherings, the emotional labor I invested in maintaining harmony within our friend group when conflicts arose. They had constructed a narrative where their financial contributions made them the generous partners, while my labor contributions were simply the expected behavior of someone grateful for their friendship.
Money had value that created obligation, but time and effort were just the natural responses of someone receiving their charity. Mia gathered the budget papers and business proposal, stacking them neatly and sliding them toward my side of the table. Take these home and really think about it, okay? We're not asking for an answer tonight, but we do need to know soon. There are seasonal considerations with the business launch. And honestly, we can't wait forever for you to decide whether you trust us enough to take this opportunity. Another subtle deadline, another form of pressure designed to prevent careful consideration or outside consultation. They wanted my decision to be emotional rather than analytical, based on gratitude and social obligation rather than genuine evaluation of their proposal's merits. The friendship they had cultivated was designed to make refusal feel like betrayal, and acceptance feel like the only way to preserve relationships I valued. I picked up the papers and folded them carefully, sliding them into my thrift store purse with the solemnity of someone receiving important documents. Around us, the conversation at other tables continued normally, people discussing work schedules and family plans and weekend activities. None of them were negotiating the terms of their continued friendship or having their financial competence questioned by people who claimed to care about their welfare. The weight of 3 years of performance pressed down on me as I sat in that familiar chair, surrounded by people who thought they knew me but had never bothered to discover who I actually was. They had fallen in love with a fiction I created, built their plans around a character I portrayed, and constructed their friendship around dynamics that served their needs rather than mine. Tyler checked his phone one more time, then announced he needed to leave early for a morning inventory delivery. The signal released the rest of us from the artificial intensity of the intervention, allowing normal social rhythms to resume. We divided the check according to our usual pattern, with me contributing exact change for my modest order, while the others covered the larger portions with casual generosity that reinforced their superior financial positions. Outside the Rusty Anchor, the mountain air carried the sharp promise of winter that would arrive within weeks. The parking lot gravel crunched under our feet as we headed toward our respective vehicles, the sound somehow emphasizing the performance we had all been maintaining. Their cars were newer, more reliable, better suited to mountain weather conditions. Mine was the obvious problem child, the automotive equivalent of my supposed financial status. Brandon walked me to my Honda, his arm around my shoulders, in a gesture that felt more possessive than affectionate. Under the pale light of the parking lot's single street lamp, his face looked different, harder somehow, as if the successful completion of their intervention had revealed aspects of his personality that he normally kept hidden. "Think about what we talked about tonight, okay?" His voice carried the tone of someone who expected compliance rather than consideration. "This is bigger than just money, Zoe. This is about whether you're ready to stop being a victim of your circumstances and start taking control of your life." I nodded, playing the role of someone overwhelmed by the generosity and wisdom of friends who cared enough to stage an intervention. Inside, different calculations were taking place, measuring not the value of their business proposal, but the cost of maintaining relationships built on deception and exploitation. As I drove the familiar route back to Pine Ridge Apartments, the Honda's engine rattling reassuringly in the mountain darkness, I realized that the evening had clarified something I had been avoiding for months. The experiment was over. 3 years of performed poverty had revealed exactly what I needed to know about these people and their motivations. The question now was what to do with that knowledge and whether anything authentic could be built from such fundamentally dishonest foundations. The drive back to Pine Ridge Apartments gave me 23 minutes to think. 23 minutes of winding mountain roads and engine noise to process what had just happened and decide how to respond. By the time I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot, dodging the same potholes I had been navigating for 3 years, my decision was made. The performance was about to end, but not in the way they expected. I climbed the 2 flights of stairs to my studio apartment, the wooden steps creaking under my feet with the familiar protests of a building that had seen better decades. The hallway smelled like whatever Mrs. Henderson was cooking next door, probably her famous pot roast that filled the entire second floor with the scent of comfort food and domesticity. It was a smell that had once made me feel lonely, isolated in my careful deception. Tonight, it felt like the last act of a play I was ready to finish. Inside my studio, I didn't turn on the overhead light.
Instead, I used the small desk lamp that cast everything in warm, intimate shadows. The space looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. The modest home of someone making $32,000 a year and struggling to build a future from the remnants of bad financial decisions. Secondhand furniture arranged efficiently to maximize the 400 square feet. A kitchenette with mismatched dishes and generic brand foods. A Murphy bed that doubled as a couch during the day. Even the artwork on the walls had been carefully selected from thrift stores and garage sales to maintain the illusion of someone making the best of limited resources. But behind the false wall I had constructed in what appeared to be a storage closet, my real office hummed quietly with the technology that managed nearly $900 million in global investments. 3 monitors displayed real-time market data from exchanges in New York, London, Hong Kong, and Sydney. My secure laptop connected through encrypted channels to investment firms that handled portfolios for ultra-high net worth individuals whose names appeared in Forbes rankings and financial magazines. The contrast between my performed poverty and actual wealth was so extreme it had become almost surreal. I made myself a cup of generic instant coffee, the kind that cost $2 for a jar that lasted 3 weeks, and sat down at my small dining table with Brandon's business proposal. Reading through their carefully crafted presentation, I couldn't help but admire the thoroughness of their planning. They had researched market conditions, identified target demographics, calculated startup costs, and projected revenue streams with the kind of attention to detail that suggested genuine entrepreneurial ambition. What they hadn't calculated was the psychology of their target investor. They assumed desperation would make me grateful for any opportunity to escape my circumstances. They believed financial stress would override careful analysis and make me eager to trust friends who offered solutions. Most importantly, they expected gratitude to generate compliance, loyalty to prevent examination of terms that heavily favored their interests over mine. Their business proposal requested $50,000 in exchange for a 25% ownership stake in their adventure tourism venture. The mathematics were elegant in their unfairness. They would contribute sweat equity while I absorbed all financial risk, yet they would retain controlling interest and decision-making authority. If the business succeeded, they would benefit more than I would. If it failed, I would lose my investment while they would lose only time and effort they had already decided to spend. But the proposal revealed something more valuable than their business acumen. It showed me exactly how they viewed our relationship and what they believed I was worth to them. $50,000 was the maximum amount they thought I could access through credit cards, personal loans, and liquidation of modest savings.
They had calculated my desperation precisely, measured my financial stress carefully, and crafted their request to match what they believed was my breaking point. They had no idea that $50,000 represented less than 1 hour of typical gains in my investment portfolio. The amount they were requesting with such careful presentation and emotional manipulation was statistically insignificant compared to my actual net worth. I had made more money during the 2 hours we spent at the Rusty Anchor than they were asking me to invest in their future. I opened my laptop and navigated to the secure portal where my investment team provided daily portfolio updates. The numbers that appeared on the screen still felt surreal, even after 3 years of exponential growth. Total portfolio value, $894,700,000. Daily change, plus $3,200,000. Year-to-date performance, plus $67 million. The wealth accumulation had reached levels where abstract numbers replaced any connection to tangible reality. My investment success had begun in college with a computer science degree and an internship at a cryptocurrency startup that most people had never heard of. While classmates worried about student loans and entry-level salaries, I was learning about blockchain technology, smart contracts, and decentralized finance from developers who would later become billionaires. A small investment in Bitcoin when it was trading at $800 had grown into life-changing wealth when the price exploded past $60,000.
But cryptocurrency was just the beginning. I used those early gains to hire professional investment managers who introduced me to private equity opportunities, hedge fund strategies, and international markets that generated returns far beyond what traditional portfolios could achieve. Real estate investments in emerging markets, technology startups in Silicon Valley, renewable energy infrastructure projects, pharmaceutical research and development funding. My portfolio diversified across industries and continents, generating wealth faster than I could spend it, even if I abandoned all pretense of modest living. The irony was devastating. While Brandon lectured me about taking control of my financial future, I was already generating more passive income than he earned working full-time in technology sales. While Mia offered budgeting advice, my quarterly dividends exceeded her annual salary as a dental hygienist. While Tyler explained market opportunities in adventure tourism, I was investing in global markets that moved billions of dollars daily based on economic indicators they had never heard of. Yet, their intervention at the Rusty Anchor had clarified something important about the dynamics we had created. They didn't want a wealthy partner who could fund their business ventures without risk or sacrifice. They wanted a desperate dependent whose gratitude would justify their sense of superiority and whose vulnerability would make their modest generosity feel meaningful. They had fallen in love with saving me, not with knowing me. I spent the next hour researching adventure tourism businesses in Colorado, analyzing market conditions, regulatory requirements, insurance considerations, and competitive landscapes. Their proposal was actually solid from a business perspective, but their financial projections were conservative and their growth strategies were limited by small-town thinking. With proper capital investment and professional management, a venture like theirs could generate significantly higher returns than they had calculated, which gave me an idea that was both generous and slightly cruel. The next morning, I drove my rattling Honda down to Main Street and parked outside Millbrook Community Bank, where I maintained my cover as a struggling teller who couldn't afford better transportation. The building was a converted Victorian house that had been painted cheerful yellow with white trim, the kind of aesthetic choice that tourism boards loved for their promotional materials.
Inside, the bank maintained the carefully cultivated atmosphere of small-town financial institution where everyone knew your name and your business. Rachel Stone, the branch manager, looked up from her desk as I walked through the employees-only entrance. She was 10 years older than me, competent and professional, with the kind of practical intelligence that kept small-town banks profitable and customers satisfied. Her gray hair was styled efficiently, and she wore a navy blue suit that projected authority without intimidation. "Morning, Zoe. You're here early today." She glanced at her computer screen, checking the schedule. "Your shift doesn't start until 10. I settled into the chair across from her desk, adopting the nervous energy of someone about to request a significant favor. I was hoping we could talk about something personal, a financial opportunity that's come up. Rachel's expression shifted to the carefully neutral mask that bank managers used when customers approached them about money they probably couldn't afford to borrow. She had undoubtedly seen countless employees make poor financial decisions based on optimism rather than analysis, and her job required her to balance helpfulness with fiduciary responsibility. "What kind of opportunity?" she asked, her tone suggesting she was prepared to offer gentle discouragement. I pulled out Brandon's business proposal and placed it on her desk with the reverence of someone presenting their most important document. "Some friends of mine are starting an adventure tourism business. They've asked me to invest, and I think it could be really good for my financial future." Rachel picked up the proposal and read through it carefully, her banker's eye analyzing cash flow projections and market assumptions with professional skepticism. I watched her face change as she processed the numbers, the terms, and the implied relationship between investors and operators. "Zoe, I have to ask, how much money are they requesting from you specifically?" $50,000 for a 25% stake. I let my voice carry just enough excitement to suggest I thought this was a generous offer. Rachel set the proposal down and leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from neutral caution to active concern.
And how exactly do they expect you to access $50,000? Based on your salary and what I know about your financial situation, that would require significant borrowing against future income. The question gave me the opening I needed to begin the next phase of my strategy. I reached into my purse and withdrew a folder I had prepared that morning, containing carefully selected documents that would tell a very different story about my financial capabilities. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about that. I've been managing some investments on the side, and I think it might be time to liquidate some positions to take advantage of this opportunity. I handed her the folder, watching her expression change as she opened it and began reading. The documents inside were genuine, recent statements from one of my smaller investment accounts, the one I used for what my wealth management team called play money. The account showed a current value of $2,400,000 with a diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, and mutual funds that generated steady returns without requiring active management. Rachel's eyes widened as she processed the numbers, then looked up at me with the expression of someone reassessing everything they thought they knew about a situation. Zoe, I don't understand. If you have this kind of investment portfolio, why are you working as a bank teller? Why are you living in a studio apartment at Pine Ridge? The question was reasonable and deserved an honest answer, or at least a version of honesty that served my current purposes. I had prepared for this moment, crafting an explanation that would be believable while positioning me for the revelation I was planning. I inherited some money from my grandmother when I graduated college. She was very conservative about spending, but very smart about investing. I promised her I would live modestly and let the money grow instead of changing my lifestyle. I paused, letting the emotional weight of family obligation add credibility to my story. But now I'm thinking maybe it's time to use some of it to invest in my future and help my friends build something together. The explanation was partially true, which made it easier to deliver convincingly. I had inherited money from my grandmother, though considerably less than what these statements showed. And she had been conservative about spending, though her investment advice had been limited to savings accounts and government bonds. The substantial wealth represented in these documents came from my own investment success, but Rachel didn't need to know that. Rachel studied the investment statements again, clearly trying to reconcile the modest lifestyle she observed daily with the substantial wealth documented in front of her. Have you talked to a financial advisor about this business investment? Because, frankly, putting 20% of your portfolio into a single venture, especially one operated by friends, carries significant risks. Her professional concern was genuine and highlighted exactly why I needed her perspective. As a bank manager, Rachel had seen countless relationships destroyed by business partnerships that mixed friendship with money. She understood the emotional complications that arose when financial interests conflicted with personal loyalty. That's actually why I wanted to talk to you, I said, maintaining the tone of someone seeking wise counsel from a trusted authority. You've seen how these kinds of investments work out. Do you think this is a good opportunity? Rachel read through Brandon's proposal again, this time with the knowledge that I could actually afford the investment they were requesting. Her analysis shifted from protecting me from overextending financially to evaluating whether the business model was worthy of my capital. The proposal is professionally prepared and their market research seems solid, she said slowly. But the ownership structure concerns me. You're assuming all the financial risk while they retain controlling interest. If the business succeeds, you'll see some returns, but they'll benefit more from your investment than you will. Her assessment matched my own analysis, confirming that my friend's proposal was structured to benefit them at my expense. But her professional validation also served another purpose. It established Rachel as a credible witness to both my actual financial capacity and the unfair terms my friends had offered. What would you recommend? I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Rachel leaned forward, shifting into the advisory role she used with customers who had both significant assets and important decisions to make. If you're serious about investing in adventure tourism, I'd suggest funding the entire venture yourself and hiring them as employees or consultants. That way you maintain control over operations while benefiting from their expertise. The suggestion was brilliant in its simplicity and perfectly aligned with the strategy I was developing. Instead of accepting their proposal to exploit my supposed desperation, I could demonstrate my actual capabilities while offering them something far more valuable than they had requested, the opportunity to build their business without financial risk. I spent another 20 minutes discussing investment strategies and business structures with Rachel, gathering the professional insights I would need to present my counterproposal convincingly. By the time I left her office, I had established myself as someone with substantial assets and professional guidance, rather than the financially desperate target my friends believed they were manipulating. The rest of my shift at the bank passed slowly, routine transactions and customer service interactions that felt surreal given the magnitude of the decisions I was making. Every time I processed a deposit or helped someone balance their checking account, I was aware of the elaborate performance I was maintaining.
My coworkers saw me as someone living paycheck to paycheck, struggling with the same financial pressures they faced. None of them imagined that I could have purchased the bank itself without significantly impacting my overall net worth. During my lunch break, I drove to the small office complex where Tyler managed his sporting goods store. The building was typical of Millbrook's commercial district. Practical construction from the 1980s, maintained adequately, but without any aesthetic ambition. Tyler's store occupied the largest unit, selling everything from skiing equipment to hiking boots to fishing licenses, serving both tourists and locals with equal competence. I found him in the back room, processing inventory deliveries with the methodical efficiency that made his business profitable despite seasonal fluctuations. Boxes of winter gear surrounded him, preparation for the ski season that would begin within weeks and provide the majority of his annual revenue. "Hey, Zoe, thought about our conversation last night?" He looked up from his clipboard, his expression carrying the casual confidence of someone who expected positive news. "Actually, I have an alternative proposal," I said, adopting the tone of someone who had been thinking seriously about business opportunities. "What if, instead of me investing in your venture, I funded the entire startup cost and hired you three to run operations?" Tyler set down his clipboard and gave me his full attention, his analytical mind immediately beginning to process the implications of what I had suggested. "What do you mean, exactly?" I pulled out the folder Rachel had reviewed that morning, along with a business plan I had developed during my lunch break. "I mean, I provide all the capital needed to launch the business properly, hire professional consultants for marketing and operations planning, and offer you guys management positions with equity participation based on performance." The documents I showed him were impressive enough to command respect. Financial projections that accounted for seasonal variations, marketing strategies that leveraged digital platforms, operational plans that included insurance and regulatory compliance. Most importantly, the capital requirements I outlined were sufficient to launch the business at a scale that would generate meaningful revenue from the first season. Tyler read through the materials with growing amazement, occasionally looking up at me as if trying to reconcile the person he thought he knew with the professional competence demonstrated in the business plan. "Zoe, where did this come from? Yesterday you were counting quarters for coffee, and today you're talking about funding a six-figure business launch?" The question was inevitable and required an answer that would be believable while serving my strategic purposes. I had prepared for this moment, developing an explanation that would transform their perception of me without revealing the full extent of my capabilities. "I've been managing some inherited investments for the past few years," I said, letting my voice carry the mix of pride and uncertainty that someone might feel when discussing recently discovered wealth. "I lived modestly because I wanted to see how the money would grow, but I'm starting to think it's time to put some of it to work." Tyler nodded slowly, accepting the explanation with the practical mindset of someone who understood that people's financial situations could be more complicated than they appeared. "How much capital are we talking about?" "Enough to do this right. Professional equipment, comprehensive insurance, marketing budget that reaches beyond local customers. We could launch with everything we need to compete with established operations in Vail and Aspen." The scope I was describing represented a completely different level of business ambition than what they had proposed.
Instead of a modest startup hoping to generate supplemental income, I was suggesting we create a professional operation capable of significant market penetration. The financial resources required would be 10 times what they had requested from me, but the potential returns would be proportionally higher. Tyler's expression shifted from surprise to excitement as he began to understand the possibilities I was presenting. That would change everything. We could offer services that nobody else in Millbrook provides, attract customers who currently drive to Denver or Colorado Springs for adventure tourism. Exactly. But it would require full-time commitment from all of you, professional management structures and performance-based compensation, rather than just profit sharing. I was deliberately restructuring the relationship from their original proposal, where I would provide capital while remaining subordinate to their expertise, to a professional arrangement where I would control operations while compensating them for their contributions. The shift in power dynamics was substantial, though I was careful to present it as an opportunity rather than a demand. Tyler read through the business plan again, his merchant's eye analyzing profit margins and growth projections with increasing enthusiasm. This is incredible, Zoe. I mean, I knew you were smart, but this level of planning and analysis is really impressive. The compliment was genuine, and it revealed something important about how my friends had perceived me during our 3-year relationship. They had assumed financial struggle indicated intellectual limitation, that poverty reflected personal inadequacy rather than deliberate choice. The competence I was demonstrating challenged fundamental assumptions they had made about my capabilities and worth. I'd like to present this to Brandon, Mia, and Chloe together, I said, maintaining the collaborative tone that would make my proposal seem generous rather than manipulative. Maybe we could meet tomorrow evening to discuss the details. Tyler agreed enthusiastically, already envisioning the expanded business possibilities that adequate capitalization would create. As I left his store, I could see him making notes in the margins of my business plan, his merchant's eye analyzing profit margins and growth projections with increasing enthusiasm. The afternoon shift at the bank provided time to finalize the details of my strategy. I would present my friends with an offer that was genuinely generous: full funding for their business venture, professional salaries during the startup phase, and equity participation based on performance rather than initial investment. What I wouldn't reveal immediately was the full extent of my financial capabilities or the psychological experiment that had led to this moment. They would face a choice that would reveal their true motivations. They could accept an arrangement that would make their business dreams possible while acknowledging my financial superiority, or they could reject terms that didn't match their expectations of grateful dependence from someone they had attempted to exploit. Either way, the performance that had defined our relationship for 3 years was about to end. The question was whether anything genuine existed beneath the deception we had all been maintaining. The community center smelled like industrial coffee and cleaning supplies when I arrived at 6:30, half an hour before our scheduled meeting. I had chosen this location deliberately, somewhere public enough to prevent the kind of emotional manipulation that private settings encouraged, but quiet enough for the serious conversation we needed to have. The main room where local groups held meetings and events was furnished with folding tables and metal chairs, the kind of institutional setup that encouraged honest discussion rather than social performance. I arranged the chairs in a circle rather than the traditional presentation format, placing my materials on the central table where everyone could access them easily. The documents I had prepared were substantial: detailed business plans, financial projections, market analysis, and legal documentation that would formalize whatever arrangement we agreed upon.
Unlike their hastily prepared intervention 2 nights ago, this meeting would be conducted with professional thoroughness. Brandon arrived first, his confident stride and easy smile suggesting he expected this gathering to confirm his assumptions about my grateful acceptance of their generous offer. He wore dark jeans and a button-down shirt that struck the perfect balance between casual and business appropriate, the kind of carefully curated appearance he used for occasions that required him to project competence and authority. "Hey, you!" He leaned down to kiss my cheek, a gesture of familiar intimacy that felt different now that I understood his motivations more clearly. "Tyler said you had some ideas about our proposal. I'm excited to hear what you've been thinking."
His tone carried the patronizing warmth of someone prepared to encourage a child's creative suggestion before explaining why adult decisions required more sophisticated analysis. He settled into one of the chairs and glanced at the materials spread across the table, his expression shifting slightly as he processed the professional quality of what I had prepared. Mia arrived next, carrying her usual oversized purse and the kind of positive energy that she deployed like a social weapon when situations required her to maintain group harmony. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, and she wore a burgundy sweater that complemented her complexion, while projecting the effortless style she had cultivated through years of Instagram posts and fashion blog reading. "This is so exciting," she announced, settling into the chair across from Brandon and immediately reaching for the documents. "I love that we're taking our friendship to the next level by building something together. It's like we're becoming a real family." The family metaphor was interesting in its implications, suggesting she viewed our potential business relationship as an extension of the emotional bonds she believed we shared. But families, I had learned, could be the most dangerous environments for financial exploitation because emotional obligation created expectations that purely business relationships couldn't sustain. Tyler and Chloe arrived together, having apparently coordinated their schedules to walk over from the elementary school, where Chloe had been staying late to prepare materials for the next day's classes. Tyler carried a leather portfolio that looked expensive but practical, the kind of accessory that successful business owners use to convey competence without ostentation. Chloe looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from managing 25 second graders while also navigating the emotional complexities of adult friendships that were evolving beyond their original boundaries. Once everyone was seated, I took a moment to look around the circle at these 4 people who had been central to my social life for 3 years. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the community center, they looked different somehow. Smaller and more ordinary than they seemed during our usual gatherings at restaurants and bars, where mood lighting and alcohol softened everyone's edges. "Thank you all for coming," I began, adopting the tone of someone conducting a business meeting rather than a casual conversation among friends. "I know we discussed your investment proposal the other night, and I wanted to present some alternative ideas for your consideration." I reached for the first set of documents, detailed financial projections that outlined the capital requirements for launching a professionally competitive adventure tourism operation. The numbers were substantially larger than what they had requested from me, but the revenue potential was correspondingly higher. "After reviewing your business plan and conducting some additional market research, I believe your concept has significant potential. However, I think we should consider a more ambitious approach that would allow us to compete directly with established operations in larger markets." Brandon leaned forward, his sales training evident in the way he positioned his body to convey engagement and authority.
What kind of numbers are we talking about? I handed him the financial summary, watching his expression change as he processed the scope of what I was proposing. Total startup costs of approximately $300,000, including professional equipment, comprehensive insurance, marketing budget, and operational capital for the first 2 years. The figure was 6 times larger than what they had requested from me, and I could see them struggling to understand how someone they perceived as financially struggling could suggest such substantial investment. Mia's eyebrows rose in surprise, while Tyler's analytical mind immediately began calculating the implications of operating at that scale. Chloe was the first to voice the question they were all thinking. "Zoe, where would funding like that come from? I mean, we asked you to invest $50,000, which we thought might be challenging for your situation." The moment had arrived for the first level of revelation, the careful exposure of capabilities they had never suspected. I reached into my portfolio and withdrew the investment statements I had shown Rachel that morning, placing them on the central table where everyone could examine them. "I've been managing some inherited investments for the past few years," I said, using the same explanation I had given Tyler, but allowing the documentary evidence to speak more clearly than my words. "I lived modestly because I wanted to see how the money would grow, but I'm ready to put some of it to work." The silence that followed was profound as they processed both the financial statements and the implications of what my revelation meant about everything they thought they knew about me. The investment account showed a balance of $2.4 million, enough to fund the venture I was proposing while maintaining substantial reserves for other opportunities. Brandon was the first to recover, his sales background providing him with the communication skills necessary to navigate unexpected information while maintaining his position of leadership within the group. This is incredible, Zoe. I mean, we had no idea you were managing this kind of portfolio. His tone carried a mixture of admiration and something else, something that sounded almost like resentment that I had concealed resources that could have benefited him earlier. The shift in his perception was subtle, but unmistakable, as if my financial capabilities had somehow altered the fundamental nature of who I was in his eyes. Mia reached for the investment statements, studying them with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become much more complex. But why didn't you tell us? I mean, if you had this money all along, why were you living like you were struggling? The question was reasonable and deserved an honest answer, though the full truth would have to be revealed gradually to maintain credibility. I had prepared for this moment, developing an explanation that would satisfy their curiosity while positioning me for the next phase of my strategy. My grandmother made me promise to live modestly and let the money grow rather than changing my lifestyle. She believed that inherited wealth should be used to create opportunities rather than fund consumption. I paused, allowing the emotional weight of family obligation to add credibility to my explanation. But I'm starting to think she would have approved of investing in something that could benefit all of us. The family obligation narrative was believable because it drew on values they understood and respected, while also explaining why I had concealed resources that could have benefited them earlier. It positioned my revelation as honoring a deceased relative's wishes rather than choosing to deceive them for personal reasons. Tyler leaned back in his chair, his analytical mind processing the new information and its implications for their original proposal. So, when we asked you to invest $50,000, you could have actually afforded it without any financial stress.
Yes, I admitted, maintaining the tone of someone sharing information reluctantly but honestly. But your proposal had some structural issues that concerned me. That's why I wanted to suggest an alternative arrangement. I reached for the next set of documents, detailed partnership agreements that outlined how we could structure the business to benefit everyone while protecting my investment. The legal language was professional and comprehensive, clearly drafted by attorneys who specialized in business formation and investment protection. Instead of me investing in your venture, I'm proposing that I fund the entire operation and hire all of you as partners, with equity participation based on performance. You would receive competitive salaries from the beginning, plus ownership stakes that grow as the business succeeds. The offer was genuinely generous, providing them with immediate income security while still allowing them to benefit from the business growth they would help create. But it also fundamentally altered the power dynamics they had assumed would govern our business relationship. Brandon studied the partnership agreement carefully, his expression growing more serious as he understood the implications of what I was proposing. This would make you the majority owner and primary decision maker. Yes, because I would be providing all the capital and assuming all the financial risk, I replied, maintaining the reasonable tone of someone explaining obvious business logic. But you would all have protected positions, guaranteed compensation, and the opportunity to earn substantial equity based on your contributions to the company's success. The arrangement I was proposing was standard for ventures where one party provided capital while others contributed expertise and labor. But it contradicted their expectations about how our personal relationships would translate into business partnerships, particularly their assumption that my supposed desperation would make me grateful for terms that benefited them more than me. Mia set down the partnership agreement and looked directly at me, her expression carrying the kind of hurt confusion that suggested she felt personally betrayed by my financial revelations. I don't understand why you let us worry about you for 3 years if you were actually fine financially. We tried to help you budget and save money, and all this time you had more than all of us combined. Her emotional response revealed something important about how she had constructed our friendship and what role my apparent financial struggles had played in her sense of identity within our group. My supposed poverty had allowed her to feel generous and wise, to offer advice and assistance that positioned her as the successful friend helping someone less fortunate. Chloe nodded in agreement, her teacher's instincts engaging with what she perceived as a lesson about honesty and trust. It feels like you were lying to us about something really fundamental. How are we supposed to know what else about our friendship was real? The accusations were predictable and deserved acknowledgement, though they also revealed the psychological dynamics that had made my deception both possible and necessary. They had needed me to be financially vulnerable to justify their sense of superiority, just as I had needed to understand their true motivations by creating circumstances that revealed them. "You're right to feel confused," I said, maintaining a tone of sincere regret without accepting full responsibility for the deception. I should have been more honest about my financial situation, but I also needed to understand who my real friends were before I made any major commitments. The explanation suggested that my concealment was a form of protection rather than manipulation, a reasonable response to the difficulty of knowing whether people cared about me personally or were interested in what my wealth could provide for them. It reframed the moral implications of my deception while acknowledging their right to feel misled.
Tyler's response was more practical than emotional, his merchant's mind focusing on the business opportunities rather than the personal dynamics. Regardless of how we got here, this is an incredible opportunity. The funding level you're talking about would let us create something really special. His willingness to move past the personal issues toward practical considerations suggested that his interest in our business partnership was more genuine than his interest in our personal relationships. He was the kind of person who could separate friendship from financial opportunity, evaluating each on its own merits rather than allowing emotional considerations to cloud business judgment. Brandon's reaction was more complex, his expression cycling through surprise, calculation, and something that looked almost like anger before settling into the controlled neutrality he used during difficult sales negotiations. This changes everything about how we would structure the business and what role each of us would play. It does, I agreed, recognizing that his discomfort stemmed from the loss of control he had expected to maintain over both the business venture and our personal relationship. But it also makes success much more likely and provides security that your original proposal couldn't offer. The documents I had prepared included detailed financial projections that demonstrated how professional capitalization would enable the business to achieve revenue levels impossible under their original funding model. With proper investment in equipment, marketing, and operations, we could capture market share from established competitors and generate profits that would benefit everyone involved. Mia looked around the circle at the others, seeming to seek consensus about how to respond to the fundamental shift in power dynamics that my revelation had created. "I think we need to discuss this privately before we can give you an answer." Her request was reasonable and revealed that they recognized the need to recalibrate their strategy in response to information that contradicted all their assumptions about my financial capabilities and their negotiating position. They had expected to be offering charity to someone desperate for their assistance. Instead, they were being offered employment by someone whose resources dwarfed their own. "Of course," I replied, beginning to gather my materials while maintaining the collegial tone of someone conducting productive business discussions. "Take whatever time you need, but I should mention that I'm planning to move forward with or without your participation." The statement was delivered casually, but its implications were clear. I was no longer seeking their approval or dependent on their expertise. I had the resources to hire professional guides, marketing consultants, and operational managers if they chose not to accept the terms I was offering. Their participation would be welcome, but was not necessary for my success. Brandon's jaw tightened slightly, a micro-expression that revealed his recognition of how completely the power dynamics had shifted. "When do you need our decision?" "Friday," I said, allowing them 3 days to discuss the offer and understand its implications. "I'm meeting with some potential consultants next week, and I'd like to know whether we're moving forward as a group or if I need to pursue other options." As we walked out of the community center into the cool mountain evening, the conversation was markedly different from our usual social interactions. The easy camaraderie that had characterized our friendship had been replaced by the formal courtesy that people use when conducting business with acquaintances whose personal motivations were unclear. Brandon walked beside me toward the parking area, his expression thoughtful in the way that suggested he was processing multiple implications simultaneously. "Zoe, can I ask you something directly?" I nodded, prepared for whatever question he felt compelled to ask.
Did you deliberately mislead us about your financial situation to test how we would react? The directness of his question deserved an equally direct response, though the full truth would have to be revealed carefully to maintain the relationship dynamics I was still managing. I wanted to understand what kind of people you were before I made any major commitments. Wealth changes how people treat you, and I needed to know who my real friends were. His expression shifted to something that looked almost like respect, as if my strategic thinking had earned his professional admiration even while it challenged his personal assumptions about me. That's actually pretty smart, even if it feels manipulative. No more manipulative than asking someone you think is desperate to invest money they can't afford to lose, I replied, maintaining a tone of calm observation rather than accusation. He stopped walking and turned to face me directly, his expression serious in the way that preceded important admissions. "Point taken. I guess we have some things to reconsider about how we've been approaching this situation." The acknowledgement was more honest than I had expected and suggested that he understood the moral complexities of what had transpired between us. Whether that understanding would translate into genuine change in his behavior remained to be seen, but it indicated that my strategy was forcing him to confront aspects of his own motivations that he had previously avoided examining. As I drove home through the familiar mountain roads, I reflected on how the evening had unfolded and what it revealed about the people I had considered my closest friends in Millbrook. Their reactions to my financial revelation had been illuminating, displaying the psychological dynamics that wealth created in personal relationships and the ways that money complicated even the most seemingly straightforward interactions. The next 3 days would determine whether anything genuine could be built from the foundations we had established, or whether the friendships I had cultivated through deception were too compromised by mutual manipulation to survive the truth. Either way, the performance that had defined my life in Colorado was drawing to a close, and the person I revealed myself to be would have to navigate whatever relationships emerged from the ruins of what we had pretended to share. Friday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that only October in the Colorado mountains could provide. I stood at the window of my real office, not the cramped studio apartment they knew about, but the executive suite I maintained in Denver's financial district. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the Rocky Mountains stretching toward the horizon, their peaks already dusted with snow that promised another profitable ski season for Colorado's tourism industry. My phone had been silent since Wednesday evening, which told me everything I needed to know about their deliberations. If they had been enthusiastic about my proposal, Brandon would have called within hours. If they had been confused but interested, Tyler would have sent carefully worded text messages seeking clarification about specific terms. If they had been offended but willing to negotiate, Neil would have arranged a coffee meeting to discuss their concerns with the diplomatic skills she used to manage difficult customers at the dental clinic.
The silence meant they were struggling with something more fundamental than business terms or partnership structures. They were confronting the collapse of their entire understanding of who I was and what role I played in their lives. The financially vulnerable friend who needed their guidance and support had been revealed as someone whose weekly portfolio gains exceeded their annual salaries. The grateful recipient of their charity had demonstrated capabilities that made their assistance irrelevant. At exactly 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a text message from Brandon. Short, formal, completely unlike his usual communication style. Need to talk. Can you meet at the Rusty Anchor tonight, 7 o'clock? I responded with equal brevity. See you there.
The day passed slowly. Routine meetings with my investment management team and conference calls with portfolio companies that required my attention as a major stakeholder. The contrast between my professional life and the performance I had maintained in Millbrook was so extreme it felt like living in parallel universes. In Denver, I was consulted on strategic decisions involving hundreds of millions of dollars. In Millbrook, my friends had worried about my ability to afford coffee. By 6:30, I was back in my rattling Honda, driving the familiar mountain roads toward a conversation that would determine whether the relationships I had built through deception could evolve into something authentic. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, reminders that winter was approaching and seasonal businesses would soon face the challenges that separated successful ventures from wishful thinking. The Rusty Anchor looked exactly the same as it had on Wednesday night, but the atmosphere felt different as I walked through the heavy wooden door. Brandon sat alone at our usual table, 2 beer bottles in front of him, suggesting he had been there for some time. His expression was difficult to read, controlled in the way that people learn to mask strong emotions when public settings required composure. "Where are the others?" I asked, settling into the chair across from him. "They decided I should handle this conversation," he replied, his voice carrying a formality that confirmed how completely our relationship dynamics had shifted. "We've discussed your proposal extensively, and we have some concerns." The phrase "some concerns" was carefully chosen, suggesting they had identified problems with my offer that justified rejection while maintaining the pretense that their objections were based on business rather than personal considerations. I waited for him to continue, maintaining the patient expression of someone prepared to listen to legitimate feedback. "First, we're uncomfortable with the power imbalance your proposal creates. You would have complete control over operations, personnel decisions, and strategic direction. We would essentially be employees rather than partners." His objection was technically accurate, but revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how investment partnerships typically functioned. The party providing capital usually retained decision-making authority to protect their financial interests, while those contributing labor and expertise received compensation and equity participation based on their contributions to success. "That's standard for ventures where one party provides funding while others contribute expertise," I replied, maintaining the educational tone of someone explaining basic business principles. "But I'm open to discussing specific concerns about operational control." Brandon took a long drink from his beer before continuing, his movements deliberate in the way that suggested he was working through a prepared presentation. "Second, we're troubled by the deception you've maintained for 3 years. If you were capable of funding this venture independently, why did you allow us to believe you needed our help?" The questions struck to the heart of the psychological dynamics that had governed our relationships, and it deserved an honest answer, even if the full truth would be painful for all of us to acknowledge. I had prepared for this moment, understanding that my experiment in performed poverty would eventually require explanation and justification. "I wanted to understand who you were when you thought I had nothing to offer except gratitude," I said, meeting his eyes directly. "Wealth changes how people treat you, and I needed to know whether our friendships were based on who I am or what I could provide." The explanation hung in the air between us, honest and unforgiving in its implications. Brandon's expression shifted through several emotions before settling into something that looked like grudging respect mixed with genuine hurt. "So, our entire relationship was a test that we apparently failed?"
Not a test, I corrected, though the distinction was probably too subtle to matter at this point. An opportunity to see who you really were when you thought you had all the power in our relationship. Brandon leaned back in his chair, his sales training evident in how he maintained eye contact while processing information that challenged his fundamental assumptions about himself and others. "And what did you discover about us?" The question invited honesty that would probably end whatever remained of our personal relationships, but dishonesty at this point would make any future interaction meaningless. I had spent 3 years learning who these people were when they believed they had advantages over me. They deserved to understand what that knowledge had revealed. I discovered that you cared more about feeling superior than actually helping someone you claimed to care about. I discovered that your advice and assistance came with expectations of gratitude and compliance that had nothing to do with my actual needs or interests. I discovered that you were more comfortable with me being dependent on you than with me being successful independently. Each observation landed with the impact of carefully aimed criticism, and I could see Brandon processing not just my words, but the behavioral patterns they described. The discomfort on his face suggested he recognized the accuracy of what I was saying, even if he didn't like the implications for his self-image. "That's pretty harsh," he said finally, his voice carrying defensiveness mixed with reluctant acknowledgement. "But not inaccurate," I replied, maintaining the calm tone of someone stating observable facts rather than making personal attacks. Brandon finished his beer and signaled the bartender for another, buying time to formulate his response. When he spoke again, his voice carried the measured cadence of someone who had decided to abandon diplomatic language in favor of direct confrontation. "Fine. Let's be completely honest then. Yes, we enjoyed feeling like we were helping you. Yes, we liked being the ones with answers when you had problems. Yes, we assumed you would be grateful for our friendship and support. But that doesn't make us monsters, Zoe. It makes us human." His admission was more honest than I had expected, and revealed a level of self-awareness that suggested our conversation might be more productive than I had anticipated. He was acknowledging the psychological dynamics that had governed our relationships without attempting to justify them as entirely altruistic. "You're right," I agreed, recognizing that my own behavior hadn't been entirely noble. "And I'm not claiming moral superiority here. I deceived you about something fundamental, and that deception served my purposes as much as your assumptions served yours." The acknowledgement created space for a different kind of conversation, one where we could examine what had happened between us without pretending that either side had been entirely innocent or entirely guilty. The question was whether anything constructive could emerge from such honest examination. "So, where does that leave us?" Brandon asked, his question carrying genuine curiosity rather than the tactical calculation that had characterized most of our interactions since Wednesday evening. "It leaves us with a choice," I said, reaching into my purse for the final document I had prepared for this conversation. "We can end our relationships here, with mutual understanding of what they actually were, or we can try to build something honest from what we've learned about each other." The document I placed on the table was different from the business proposals I had presented earlier in the week. It was a personal letter, handwritten rather than typed, addressed to the four of them collectively and outlining my perspective on what had transpired between us and what possibilities existed for moving forward. Brandon read the letter carefully, his expression shifting as he processed not just my words, but the gesture of vulnerability that sharing such personal thoughts represented. When he finished, he looked up with an expression I hadn't seen before. Something that looked like genuine respect for who I actually was, rather than who he had assumed me to be. "This is different from anything you've shown us before," he said, his voice carrying surprise at the emotional honesty the letter contained. "Because this isn't about business," I replied. "This is about whether we can have authentic relationships after everything we've discovered about each other." The letter outlined my willingness to fund their business venture under terms that gave them genuine partnership status, not as charity or manipulation, but as an investment in people whose capabilities I respected, even if I disagreed with their previous behavior. It also acknowledged my own responsibility for the deception that had shaped our relationships and offered a framework for moving forward that didn't require anyone to pretend the past 3 years had been something they weren't. Brandon read through the letter again, then set it down carefully, as if it were something fragile that required gentle handling. "The others need to see this." "I hoped they would," I said.
understanding that my letter represented a different kind of proposal than the business documents I had prepared earlier. Take whatever time you need to discuss it. We sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the familiar sounds of the rusty anchor during the early evening hours when locals gathered for dinner and tourists planned their next day's activities. The conversation around us was ordinary, people discussing work schedules and weekend plans and the approaching ski season, normal interactions that didn't carry the weight of fundamental relationship recalibration. "Can I ask you something?" Brandon said finally, his voice carrying the tentative quality of someone approaching sensitive territory. I nodded, prepared for whatever question he felt compelled to ask. "Do you actually want to be friends with us, or is this just another experiment in seeing how people react to wealth?" The question was perceptive and deserved an honest answer, even if that honesty revealed uncertainty about my own motivations. I had spent so much time analyzing their behavior that I hadn't fully examined what I hoped to achieve beyond proving my theories about human psychology and financial relationships. "I don't know," I admitted, appreciating his directness enough to match it with my own. "I started this to understand who you were, but I never really considered what I wanted our relationships to become if the experiment revealed uncomfortable truths." Brandon nodded slowly, as if my uncertainty was somehow reassuring rather than disappointing. "At least that's honest. Most people pretend they have everything figured out when they're actually just as confused as everyone else." His observation suggested a level of emotional intelligence that I hadn't previously recognized, and it made me wonder what other aspects of his personality had been obscured by the power dynamics that had governed our interactions. When people believed they needed to perform superiority, their authentic selves often disappeared beneath carefully constructed personas designed to maintain advantage. "What do you want?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective on possibilities I hadn't fully considered. Brandon considered the question carefully, his expression thoughtful in the way that suggested he was examining his own motivations with the same honesty he had applied to analyzing mine. "I want to work with someone I respect rather than someone I think I need to rescue. I want to build something meaningful rather than just profitable, and I want to know that the people I care about are being honest with me about who they are." His answer was more mature than I had expected and suggested that the psychological dynamics I had been studying worked in both directions. Just as my performed poverty had concealed my actual capabilities, their performed superiority had hidden genuine desires for authentic collaboration and mutual respect.
Those seem like reasonable things to want, I said, recognizing that we might have more common ground than our previous interactions had suggested. The question is whether any of us are capable of providing them after everything that's happened. The observation was accurate and highlighted the central challenge facing any attempt to rebuild our relationships on more honest foundations. Trust, once compromised by mutual deception and manipulation, required conscious effort and genuine commitment to restore. We would have to choose to believe in each other's capacity for growth and change. My phone buzzed with a text message from Tyler. "Brandon, filling you in on our conversation. Can we all meet tomorrow night? Same place, same time. We want to try again." I showed the message to Brandon, who smiled for the first time since I had arrived. "They decided pretty quickly after reading your letter." "And you?" I asked, wanting to understand his personal decision separate from whatever group consensus had emerged. "I'm in," he said, his voice carrying conviction that surprised me. "Not because I need the business opportunity, but because I think we could actually build something worthwhile if we're honest about who we are and what we want." The evening air was sharp with approaching winter when we left the rusty anchor, but the cold felt refreshing rather than bitter. We walked to our cars in comfortable silence, the weight of unresolved tension finally beginning to lift after days of careful navigation around emotional landmines and psychological revelations. "Zoe," Brandon said as I reached for my car door, "I'm sorry about how we handled things before. The intervention, the assumptions, the way we treated you like you needed saving instead of respecting your choices." His apology was unexpected and seemed genuine, carrying the weight of someone who had examined his own behavior and found it wanting. "Thank you," I replied, appreciating his willingness to acknowledge mistakes without attempting to justify them. "And I'm sorry for the deception," I added, recognizing that my own behavior had contributed to the dynamics that had damaged our relationships.
I should have found a way to understand who you were without misleading you about who I am. The mutual acknowledgement of responsibility created space for something different to develop between us. Relationships built on actual knowledge rather than convenient assumptions. Whether we could successfully navigate that transition remained to be seen, but the willingness to try felt like progress. Saturday evening brought all four of them to the Rusty Anchor, with expressions that ranged from cautious optimism to genuine excitement. Mia had prepared notes about marketing strategies that leveraged social media platforms she understood better than any consultant I could hire. Tyler brought detailed operational plans that demonstrated his deep knowledge of adventure tourism logistics. Chloe offered insights about educational programming that could differentiate our services from purely recreational competitors. Most importantly, they approached the conversation as equals, rather than as charity recipients or financial opportunities. They asked probing questions about my investment philosophy, challenged assumptions in my business projections, and contributed ideas that genuinely improved the venture we were considering. The partnership agreement we developed that evening was different than anything I had previously proposed. Equal voting rights on major decisions, profit sharing based on actual contributions rather than initial investment, and operational responsibilities that played to each person's strengths rather than hierarchical authority structures. 6 months later, Mountain Peak Adventures generated revenue that exceeded our most optimistic projections. More importantly, the working relationships we developed proved that authentic collaboration was possible when people chose honesty over manipulation and mutual respect over comfortable deception. I never returned to the studio apartment at Pine Ridge or the job at Millbrook Community Bank.
Instead, I moved into a home that reflected my actual circumstances while remaining accessible to friends who knew the truth about my financial situation. The performance that had defined 3 years of my life ended, replaced by relationships built on actual knowledge rather than convenient fictions. The most surprising discovery was that authentic friendship proved more satisfying than the psychological experiment that had preceded it. When people related to who I actually was, rather than who they needed me to be, the connections we formed carried depth and resilience that performed relationships could never achieve. Sometimes the greatest wealth isn't what you accumulate in secret, but what you build when you finally stop hiding who you are. The portfolio that hit 890 million was just numbers on a screen. The relationships that survived honest revelation were investments that would appreciate for the rest of my life. Trust, I learned, was the most valuable currency of all. And unlike money, it could only be earned through the one thing I had spent 3 years avoiding: the courage to be genuinely known. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.